The Baby Farmer's Cradle, the true crime story of Amelia Dyer. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Chapter 1. A World of Desperation. The gas lamps of Victorian England cast long, dancing shadows across cobbled streets, illuminating a society steeped in stark contrasts. It was an era of unprecedented industrial growth, scientific advancement, and imperial expansion, yet beneath the veneer of progress lay a profound undercurrent of social inequality, moral rigidity, and widespread destitution. For many, particularly women, life was a precarious existence, dictated by societal expectations and economic vulnerability. This was the world into which Amelia Dyer's victims, and indeed Dyer herself, were born and operated. The rigid moral code of the Victorian age placed an immense premium on female chastity and the sanctity of the nuclear family. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock faced immediate and severe social ostracization. She was branded a fallen woman, her reputation irrevocably ruined, and her prospects for marriage, respectable employment, or even social acceptance all but extinguished. The father, conversely, often escaped with little to no consequence, leaving the woman to bear the full weight of societal condemnation and the practical burden of raising a child alone. Economic realities compounded this moral judgment. For working-class women, employment opportunities were scarce and poorly paid, often confined to domestic service, factory work, or piecework from home. Supporting oneself was a struggle. Supporting an infant without a husband or family support was, for many, an insurmountable task. The workhouses, grim institutions designed to deter poverty rather than alleviate it, offered a last resort, but at the cost of personal liberty and often the separation of mothers from their children. Charitable organizations existed, but their resources were limited, and their assistance often came with moralistic conditions. It was within this crucible of desperation that the practice of baby farming emerged and flourished. This unregulated industry offered a clandestine solution for women seeking to conceal an illegitimate birth or to find care for a child they could not afford to keep. Baby farmers, typically women themselves, advertised their services in local newspapers, promising to adopt or care for infants for a fee. These advertisements often used euphemistic language, speaking of respectable homes and Christian upbringing, preying on the hopes and fears of vulnerable mothers. The fees varied, ranging from a lump sum payment for permanent adoption to weekly payments for ongoing care. For a mother desperate to avoid scandal and secure a future for herself, even a meager one, these arrangements seemed to offer a lifeline. However, the reality was often far darker. With no oversight or legal protection for the children, baby farming became a fertile ground for neglect, abuse, and in the most heinous cases, murder. The infants, once handed over, effectively vanished from public record, their fates known only to the baby farmer. They were the most vulnerable members of an already vulnerable society, voiceless and utterly dependent on the dubious care they received. The sheer volume of illegitimate births, coupled with the lack of effective contraception and the severe social penalties for single mothers, created a constant supply of infants for the baby farmers. It was a grim reflection of a society that, while outwardly pious, often failed to provide a safety net for its most defenseless members. The anonymity of the large, bustling cities, the rudimentary nature of police investigations, and the general indifference to the plight of the poor and marginalized allowed this dark trade to persist and expand for decades. It was in this shadow, where desperation met opportunity, that Amelia Dyer would carve out her infamous career, becoming one of England's most prolific serial killers. Her story is not merely one of individual depravity, but a chilling indictment of the societal conditions that enabled her reign of terror. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. Amelia Dyer was born Amelia Elizabeth Hobley in the small village of East Bristol, near Bristol, England, in 1837. Her early life, by most accounts, began without the overt signs of the darkness that would later consume her. She was the youngest of 5 children to Samuel Hobley, a master shoemaker, and Sarah Hobley. The family was respectable if not affluent, and Amelia received a basic education, learning to read and write, a privilege not universally afforded to girls of her social standing at the time. This early education would later prove instrumental in her ability to craft deceptive advertisements and manage her illicit business. Her childhood was marked by a significant and formative experience. Her mother, Sarah, suffered from a mental illness. Amelia, as the youngest, bore a considerable burden in caring for her mother, witnessing firsthand the debilitating effects of mental instability. This exposure to illness and suffering, coupled with the responsibilities thrust upon her at a young age, may have desensitized her or, conversely, instilled a twisted sense of control over the vulnerable. It certainly provided her with an early, intimate understanding of the fragility of life and the demands of caregiving. In her early 20s, Amelia pursued a career that seemed to align with her experiences and the societal expectations for women of her class: nursing. She trained as a nurse, a profession that required a degree of compassion, medical knowledge, and meticulous attention to detail. This training would later be perverted into a tool for her crimes, providing her with knowledge of sedatives and the means to handle infants with a deceptive air of competence. In 1858, at the age of 21, Amelia married George Thomas, a much older man who worked as a brewer. The age difference was significant, with George being 59 at the time of their marriage. This union, while perhaps offering a degree of stability, also placed Amelia in a position of caring for an aging husband. They had one daughter together, Ellen Thomas, born in 1861. The early years of her marriage appear to have been relatively conventional, but the seeds of future hardship were already being sown. George Thomas passed away in 1869, leaving Amelia a widow with a young daughter. The loss of her husband, coupled with the financial strain of single motherhood in Victorian England, pushed her towards greater economic precarity. It was around this time that her legitimate nursing practice began to shift. The demand for discreet care for illegitimate children was growing, and Amelia, with her nursing background, found herself drawn to this lucrative, albeit morally ambiguous, niche. Her second marriage, to William Dyer, a brewer's laborer, occurred in 1872. This marriage produced two more children, William Samuel and Mary Ann. However, this period was also marked by increasing instability. Amelia's mental health, perhaps exacerbated by the stresses of her life, began to deteriorate. She was institutionalized on several occasions, diagnosed with puerperal mania, a form of postpartum psychosis, and other mental health issues. These periods of confinement, while offering a temporary respite from her responsibilities, also exposed her to the harsh realities of Victorian mental asylums and further isolated her from mainstream society. It is during these turbulent years, between her first widowhood and her second marriage, and amidst her own struggles with mental health and financial hardship, that Amelia Dyer's path began its definitive turn towards criminality. The compassion and care expected of a nurse slowly eroded, replaced by a cold calculation. The knowledge she gained in her profession, once used for healing, would soon be twisted into a means of systematic murder. The desperation of her own circumstances, combined with the societal conditions that created a constant supply of vulnerable infants, provided the fertile ground for her transformation from a struggling mother and nurse into one of England's most notorious serial killers. The stage was set for her to exploit the very system designed to offer solace, turning the baby farming industry into a macabre enterprise of death. Chapter 3: The Business of Betrayal. The burgeoning industrial cities of Victorian England, with their anonymity and rapid social change, provided fertile ground for illicit trades, and none was perhaps more tragically exploitative than baby farming. This unregulated industry thrived on the desperation of unmarried mothers and the societal imperative to conceal illegitimate births. For a fee, baby farmers promised to take in unwanted infants, either for temporary care or permanent adoption, offering a discreet solution to a deeply stigmatized problem. Advertisements for these services were commonplace in local newspapers, often placed under euphemistic headings such as Nurses Wanted, Child to Adopt, or Respectable Home for Infant. They would typically promise a loving home, good care, and a Christian upbringing, all for a modest sum. A typical advertisement might read, "Married couple, no family, wish to adopt a healthy child. Good home and every comfort guaranteed. Moderate premium." These carefully worded solicitations were designed to appeal to the hopes of desperate mothers, masking the grim reality that often awaited their children. Amelia Dyer, with her background as a trained nurse and her own experiences with financial hardship, was uniquely positioned to exploit this market. She understood the medical needs of infants, the anxieties of mothers, and the mechanics of running a household. Initially, her practice may have begun with a semblance of legitimacy, offering genuine care for a fee. However, the financial pressures were immense, and the temptation to cut corners, to maximize profit at the expense of the infant's welfare, proved too strong. Her early methods involved taking in infants for a lump sum payment, typically between £5 and £10, a significant amount for a working-class woman. This premium was meant to cover the child's upkeep until a suitable adoptive family could be found. However, Dyer rarely sought adoptive families. Instead, the infants entrusted to her care would often suffer from severe neglect. They were underfed, kept in unsanitary conditions, and often sedated with opiates, such as Godfrey's cordial or mother's friend, readily available over-the-counter remedies containing laudanum. These concoctions, while seemingly benign, were highly dangerous for infants, causing lethargy, malnutrition, and ultimately, death by respiratory depression. The use of opiates served a dual purpose for Dyer. Firstly, it kept the infants quiet, making them less noticeable to neighbors and easier to manage, especially when she was caring for multiple children simultaneously. Secondly, it slowly weakened them, making them susceptible to illness and eventual demise, which could then be attributed to natural causes. In an era of high infant mortality, such deaths rarely raised suspicion, particularly among the poor who often lacked access to proper medical care. Dyer's modus operandi evolved over time, becoming increasingly ruthless and efficient. She would frequently move her residence, often changing her name, to avoid detection and to escape the scrutiny of neighbors or local authorities. She operated under various aliases, including Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Stewart, and Mrs. Thomas, each new identity allowing her to shed any lingering suspicions from her previous location. This constant relocation was a key strategy in her ability to evade justice for so long. The sheer volume of children she took in, combined with her systematic neglect and the use of sedatives, meant that many infants simply faded away. Their deaths were often unrecorded, or if a death certificate was issued, the cause would be vaguely attributed to debility or marasmus wasting away, common diagnoses for infant deaths at the time. The mothers, having paid their premium and often wishing to sever all ties with the illegitimate child, rarely followed up, and even if they did, Dyer had a ready explanation for the child's unfortunate passing. This early phase of her criminal enterprise, characterized by neglect and slow poisoning, laid the groundwork for the more direct and brutal methods she would later employ. It demonstrated her capacity for cold calculation, her ability to exploit societal vulnerabilities, and her chilling disregard for human life. The business of betrayal was not merely a means of survival for Amelia Dyer, it was becoming her chosen path, a dark enterprise built on the silent suffering and unseen deaths of countless infants. Chapter 4: The Mother's Plight. The women who sought the services of Amelia Dyer, and other baby farmers like her, were not a monolithic group, but they shared a common thread of profound vulnerability and desperation. In Victorian England, the societal condemnation of illegitimacy was absolute, and its consequences for a woman were devastating. A single mother faced a future stripped of respectability, often condemned to poverty, and frequently ostracized by her own family. The shame was so pervasive that many women went to extraordinary lengths to conceal their pregnancies and the subsequent birth of their child. These mothers came from various backgrounds, though often from the working classes. They might be domestic servants who had fallen pregnant by their employers, factory girls seduced by a colleague, or young women from respectable families who had made a single unforgivable mistake. Regardless of their origin, the options available to them were stark and few. They could face the public shame, endure the workhouse where their child might be taken from them, or attempt to raise the child in secret, a near impossible feat given the economic realities. It was into this chasm of despair that Amelia Dyer inserted herself, presenting an alluring, albeit false, solution. Her advertisements, often placed in local newspapers, were carefully crafted to appeal to these women's deepest anxieties. They promised discretion, a loving home, and a chance for the child to be raised in a respectable environment, all for a fee that, while substantial for a working-class woman, seemed a small price to pay for the preservation of her reputation and future. The process of handing over a child to Dyer was often shrouded in secrecy. Mothers would travel from distant towns, sometimes under false pretenses, to meet her. They would arrive with their infants, often clutching the last vestiges of their savings, hoping beyond hope that they were making the right decision. Dyer, with her nursing background and seemingly benevolent demeanor, was adept at playing the role of a compassionate caregiver. She would offer reassurances, speak of the child's future, and accept the lump sum payment, often the mother's entire life savings, or agree to weekly payments that would further drain their meager resources. For many mothers, the act of handing over their child was an agonizing one, born not of a lack of love, but of an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. They believed they were giving their child a chance at a better life, free from the stigma of illegitimacy, and simultaneously securing their own precarious future. The psychological manipulation employed by Dyer was insidious, She preyed on their maternal instincts and their societal fears, turning their love and desperation into a weapon against their own offspring. Historical records, though sparse on the individual stories of these mothers due to the very secrecy they sought, occasionally offer glimpses into their profound sorrow and the lingering doubts that haunted them. Some would write to Dyer, inquiring about their child's welfare, only to receive vague or evasive replies. Others, perhaps too ashamed or too broken, never made contact again, choosing to believe the best, or simply unable to face the truth. The tragedy of these mothers is a crucial, often overlooked, aspect of Amelia Dyer's story. They were not complicit in her crimes in any knowing sense, but rather victims of a society that offered them no viable alternatives. Their desperation fueled Dyer's enterprise, creating a constant supply of innocent lives for her to extinguish. Their plight underscores the profound social injustices of the era and highlights how systemic failures can create the conditions for individual evil to flourish unchecked. They were caught between an unforgiving moral code and a predatory system, their choices tragically limited, their hopes cruelly betrayed. Chapter 5: The Silent Departures. As Amelia Dyer's enterprise grew, so too did her ruthlessness. The initial phase of neglect and slow poisoning, while effective in disposing of infants without immediate suspicion, was inefficient and carried the risk of prolonged illness that might attract unwanted attention. Her methods evolved, becoming more direct, more chillingly efficient, and ultimately, more murderous. The silent departures of the infants entrusted to her care transitioned from passive neglect to active, deliberate termination. The use of opiates, such as Godfrey's cordial, remained a tool in her arsenal, particularly for keeping infants quiet and subdued. However, she began to employ them with a more lethal intent, administering doses that would ensure a swift, if quiet, death. The symptoms of opiate poisoning in infants, respiratory depression, lethargy, and eventual cessation of breathing, could easily be mistaken for common infant ailments or the effects of malnutrition, especially in an era where medical knowledge of such matters was limited and autopsies were rare for the poor. However, Dyer's preferred method, which she adopted with increasing frequency, was strangulation. This was a quick, silent, and brutally effective way to dispatch the infants, leaving minimal external marks that might raise immediate alarm. She often used white tape, sometimes referred to as tape for the neck, which she would wrap around the infant's throat. The choice of tape, rather than a rope or cord, suggests a deliberate attempt to make the act appear less violent, perhaps even accidental, or to mimic the appearance of a swaddling cloth. The sheer coldness of this method, applied to helpless newborns, speaks volumes about her profound lack of empathy and the complete dehumanization of her victims. The chilling efficiency with which Dyer operated was a hallmark of her later career. An infant would be handed over, a fee exchanged, and within hours, or sometimes even minutes, the child would be dead. There was no pretense of care, no period of neglect. The transaction was merely a prelude to murder. This rapid disposal allowed her to maximize her profits, taking in multiple children in quick succession without the burden of their prolonged upkeep. It also minimized the risk of a mother returning to check on her child before the deed was done. The scale of her crimes is difficult to comprehend. While the exact number of her victims remains unknown, it is widely believed to be in the hundreds, potentially making her one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. Each infant represented a life extinguished before it had truly begun, a silent tragedy swallowed by the vastness of Victorian society. The anonymity of her victims was a crucial element of her success. They were often nameless, unrecorded, and their disappearance went largely unnoticed by a society that had already deemed them unwanted. Dyer's movements were also part of her strategy. She would frequently change her address, moving between towns like Bristol, Reading, and Caversham, and adopting different aliases. This constant relocation served to distance her from previous crimes, making it harder for authorities to connect the dots or for suspicious neighbors to raise alarms. Each new location offered a fresh pool of desperate mothers and a renewed opportunity to continue her murderous trade. The sheer volume of her crimes, coupled with the lack of forensic science and the societal indifference to the fate of illegitimate children, allowed Amelia Dyer to operate with impunity for decades. The infants, once handed over, effectively ceased to exist in any official capacity. Their cries were silenced, their lives ended, and their tiny bodies disposed of with a chilling detachment. These silent departures were the grim reality of the baby farming industry, and Amelia Dyer was its most notorious and deadly practitioner. Chapter 6: A Trail of Discarded Lives. With the infants dispatched, Amelia Dyer faced the critical task of disposing of their bodies. This aspect of her operation was as cold and calculated as the murders themselves, evolving over time to minimize detection and maximize her ability to continue her gruesome trade. Her methods of disposal were a grim reflection of her systematic approach to crime, leaving a trail of discarded lives across the English landscape. In her earlier years, when her operations were perhaps less prolific or more localized, Dyer would often bury the bodies of her victims. These burials were typically clandestine, in gardens, cellars, or other secluded spots near her various residences. Such methods, while effective in the short term, carried inherent risks. A change of residence, a new tenant, or even a curious neighbor could lead to the discovery of remains, as indeed happened on at least one occasion, forcing her to move and adopt a new identity. The need for a more efficient and less traceable method of disposal became paramount as her activities escalated. Her preferred and most infamous method of body disposal involved the waterways of England, particularly the River Thames and its tributaries. This shift marked a significant escalation in her ruthlessness and a chilling understanding of how to exploit the natural environment to conceal her crimes. The river offered anonymity, a vast and constantly moving burial ground that could carry away evidence and make identification nearly impossible. Dyer would typically wrap the infant's body in a parcel, often using brown paper and string, and then weight it down with bricks or stones. These weighted bundles would then be thrown into the river, usually under the cover of darkness, from bridges or secluded riverbanks. The intention was for the bodies to sink and be carried away by the current, never to be seen again. This method was particularly effective because the infants were often so young, their bodies small and easily concealed, and the sheer volume of river traffic and debris made individual discoveries rare and difficult to trace. The geographical spread of her operations was directly linked to her need to evade detection and find new sources of victims. Dyer was a transient figure, moving frequently between towns and cities in the south of England. Her known residences and areas of operation included Bristol, Reading, Caversham, and London. Each move was a strategic decision, allowing her to escape the growing suspicions of neighbors, the inquiries of concerned mothers, or the nascent investigations of local authorities. For instance, after a period of operating in Bristol, she would relocate to Reading, establishing a new identity and a new network of contacts. From Reading, she might then move to Caversham, a nearby village, or even venture into the sprawling anonymity of London. This constant movement made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement, who operated on a localized basis with limited inter-county communication, to connect her various crimes. A death in Bristol would not easily be linked to a disappearance in Reading, especially when the perpetrator used different names and left little direct evidence. The discovery of bodies in the River Thames, particularly near Reading, eventually became the key to her downfall. While many bodies undoubtedly remained undiscovered, those that did surface provided the crucial clues that led to her apprehension. The distinctive white tape she used for strangulation, and sometimes for wrapping the bodies, became a grim signature, a thread that police could eventually follow. The trail of discarded lives left by Amelia Dyer was not just a physical one, marked by the silent currents of the Thames, but also an invisible one, etched into the records of missing children and heartbroken mothers. Each weighted bundle cast into the river represented a life brutally cut short, a testament to her cold efficiency and the profound vulnerability of her victims. Her ability to operate across such a wide geographical area, leaving behind a wake of death, underscores the systemic failures of the time to protect its most defenseless citizens. Chapter 7: The Mask of Benevolence. To understand Amelia Dyer, one must attempt to peer behind the mask of benevolence she so skillfully wore, a facade that allowed her to operate for decades as a predator in plain sight. While a definitive psychological diagnosis from a distance of over a century is impossible, a profile can be constructed from her documented actions, her consistent patterns of behavior, and the historical accounts of her interactions. What emerges is a chilling portrait of an individual characterized by profound psychopathy, marked by a severe lack of empathy, a calculated and manipulative nature, and an almost complete absence of remorse. Her ability to maintain a veneer of respectability was central to her success. Dyer presented herself as a compassionate nurse, a woman offering a vital service to desperate mothers. She crafted advertisements that spoke of respectable homes and Christian upbringing, words designed to evoke trust and alleviate the anxieties of her clients. This calculated deception, sustained over many years and through numerous aliases, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability and a willingness to exploit it without hesitation. She understood the social pressures on unmarried mothers and expertly played the role of their savior, even as she planned the demise of their children. The primary motive for her crimes was undeniably financial gain. Each infant represented a fee, a lump sum payment that fueled her lifestyle and allowed her to avoid the destitution that plagued many women of her era. However, her actions suggest something more than mere economic necessity. The sheer volume of her victims, the systematic nature of her murders, and the cold efficiency with which she dispatched infants, often within hours of receiving them, point to a deeper pathology. It was not simply about survival, it was about maximizing profit with a chilling disregard for human life. This suggests a profound objectification of her victims, reducing them from living beings to mere commodities. Her methods, particularly the use of strangulation with white tape, reveal a chilling detachment. This was not a crime of passion or impulse, but a methodical, almost ritualistic act. The choice of tape, rather than a more violent implement, could be interpreted as a perverse attempt at neatness or control, further highlighting her calculated approach. There was no evidence of struggle, no signs of remorse in her subsequent actions. She simply moved on to the next victim, the next transaction. Amelia Dyer's history of institutionalization for mental health issues, particularly puerperal mania, offers a complex layer to her profile. While these diagnoses were often broad and poorly understood in the Victorian era, they indicate periods of significant mental distress. However, it is crucial to distinguish between mental illness and psychopathy. While she may have experienced periods of depression or other conditions, her sustained, organized, and predatory behavior over decades does not align with a typical presentation of mental illness that would preclude criminal responsibility. Instead, her periods of institutionalization might have served as convenient breaks, allowing her to regroup and avoid scrutiny, rather than genuinely incapacitating her from her criminal enterprise. Her ability to resume her activities with renewed vigor after release suggests a cunning manipulation of the system, rather than a genuine incapacitation. The absence of any documented remorse or confession, even in the face of overwhelming evidence and her impending execution, further solidifies the profile of a psychopath. Her final statements and demeanor during her trial and incarceration were characterized by a stoic, almost indifferent acceptance of her fate, rather than any expression of guilt or regret for the lives she had taken. In essence, Amelia Dyer embodied the characteristics of a high-functioning psychopath, intelligent enough to plan and execute her crimes, manipulative enough to deceive her victims and evade detection, and utterly devoid of the emotional capacity to feel empathy or guilt. Her nursing background, which should have instilled a reverence for life, was instead perverted into a tool for death, providing her with the knowledge and confidence to carry out her horrific acts with chilling precision. She was a predator who thrived in the shadows of societal neglect, her mask of benevolence concealing a heart of ice. Chapter 8: The Predator's Routine. Amelia Dyer's long and horrific career was not a series of impulsive acts, but rather a meticulously managed, albeit macabre, enterprise. Her routine as a predator was characterized by a chilling blend of calculated planning, adaptability, and an unwavering focus on efficiency and self-preservation. This systematic approach allowed her to operate for decades, leaving a trail of death that stretched across multiple counties. Her business began with advertising. Dyer understood the power of the printed word and regularly placed advertisements in local newspapers, often in the situations vacant or miscellaneous sections, rather than directly under childcare. This subtle placement helped her reach her target demographic, desperate mothers seeking discretion, while avoiding immediate scrutiny from authorities who might be monitoring overt baby farming ads. The language was always reassuring, promising a good home and care, designed to elicit trust from women who had nowhere else to turn. Once contact was made, Dyer would arrange a meeting, often in a public place or a temporary lodging, to receive the infant and the agreed-upon fee. This initial interaction was crucial. She would present herself as a respectable, compassionate woman, perhaps even a former nurse, capable of providing the promised care. Her ability to project an image of trustworthiness was paramount to securing the transaction. The fee, typically a lump sum, was her primary motivation, and she ensured it was collected up front. The disposal of the infant often followed swiftly. As discussed, her methods evolved from neglect to direct strangulation, a testament to her increasing efficiency and callousness. The quicker the infant was dispatched, the sooner she could move on to the next client, maximizing her profit and minimizing the risk of detection. This rapid turnover was a key component of her routine. Following the murder, the disposal of the body was equally systematic. The use of weighted parcels and the rivers as her dumping ground became her signature. This method was chosen for its effectiveness in concealing evidence and its relative ease. She would travel to secluded spots along the Thames or its tributaries, often under the cover of darkness, to cast the bundles into the water. This routine of murder and disposal was repeated countless times, each act a cold, calculated step in her ongoing operation. Dyer's routine also included a constant state of vigilance and adaptability. She was acutely aware of the need to avoid suspicion. This led to her frequent changes of address and aliases. A new town meant a fresh start, a new set of neighbors unfamiliar with her past, and a new pool of potential victims. She would rent rooms or small houses, never staying in one place long enough for deep roots to form or for patterns of infant disappearances to become too obvious to local communities. Her movements were not random, they were strategic, designed to keep her one step ahead of any potential investigation. The psychological toll of such a routine, for a normal individual, would be immense. However, for Dyer, there is little evidence to suggest any significant internal conflict or breakdown. Her periods of institutionalization, while indicative of mental distress, did not deter her from resuming her criminal activities upon release. This suggests that her psychopathic traits allowed her to compartmentalize her actions, viewing the infants as objects rather than human beings, and her murders as a necessary part of her business model. The absence of remorse meant she could continue her routine without the burden of guilt. Her ability to manage this complex clandestine operation over decades speaks to a high degree of organizational skill and cunning. She navigated a society with rudimentary policing and limited communication between jurisdictions, exploiting these weaknesses to her advantage. Her routine was a well-oiled machine of deception, murder, and evasion, a testament to her cold, calculating mind and her profound capacity for evil. She was not merely a killer, she was a serial entrepreneur of death, meticulously managing her grim enterprise until the very end. Chapter 9: Whispers and Suspicions. For decades, the dark trade of baby farming operated largely in the shadows, sustained by societal shame and the desperate silence of its victims. However, as the Victorian era progressed, a growing unease began to permeate public consciousness. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into increasingly vocal concerns about the welfare of children entrusted to these unregulated caregivers. While Amelia Dyer perfected her deadly routine, the world around her was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shift. The sheer volume of infant deaths, particularly among illegitimate children, was a statistic that, even in an age of high mortality, began to raise questions. Coroners, though often limited in their investigative powers, occasionally voiced suspicions about the vague causes of death listed on certificates for infants who had been farmed out. Doctors, too, sometimes encountered cases of severe neglect or suspicious circumstances that hinted at foul play, though concrete evidence was often elusive. Newspapers, while sometimes complicit in publishing baby farmers' advertisements, also began to feature articles and editorials decrying the abuses within the system. Sensationalized accounts of discovered infant bodies or particularly egregious cases of neglect started to chip away at the public's complacency. Reformers and philanthropists, driven by a growing social conscience, campaigned for greater oversight of childcare arrangements and stronger protections for vulnerable children. Organizations like the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children (NSPCC), founded in 1884, began to shed light on the widespread abuse and neglect that had long been hidden. Despite these growing concerns, effective investigation into baby farming was severely hampered by several factors. Law enforcement in Victorian England was still relatively rudimentary, particularly in its ability to conduct complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations. Police forces were localized, communication between different constabularies was poor, and forensic science was in its infancy. The concept of a serial killer was not yet fully understood, and the idea that a seemingly respectable woman could systematically murder dozens, if not hundreds, of infants was almost beyond comprehension. Furthermore, the very nature of baby farming made it difficult to prosecute. The mothers, often desperate to avoid scandal, were reluctant to come forward, even if they suspected foul play. Without a complainant, investigations rarely progressed. The infants themselves were often nameless, their identities obscured by the secrecy surrounding their birth and placement. When bodies were found, they were often too decomposed for easy identification, and linking them to a specific baby farmer required an extraordinary stroke of luck or meticulous detective work. Amelia Dyer, with her constant movement and use of aliases, was particularly adept at exploiting these systemic weaknesses. She would often move just as suspicions began to mount in one locality, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unproven allegations. There were instances where she was briefly apprehended or investigated for neglect, but she always managed to escape serious charges, often by feigning mental illness or simply disappearing before a case could be built against her. These close calls, rather than deterring her, seemed to reinforce her belief in her own invincibility and the inadequacy of the authorities. Yet, the cumulative effect of these whispers and suspicions was slowly building. Each discovered body, each newspaper exposé, each reformer's plea, added another layer to the growing public awareness. The stage was being set for a more determined and coordinated effort to dismantle the baby farming industry. It would take a particularly gruesome discovery, however, to finally pierce through the veil of secrecy and bring the full horror of Amelia Dyer's crimes into the harsh light of justice. Chapter 10: The Discovery in the Thames. The spring of 1896 brought with it a grim discovery that would finally shatter the veil of secrecy surrounding Amelia Dyer's operations and expose the full horror of her crimes. For years, the rivers of England, particularly the Thames and its tributaries, had served as her silent accomplices, swallowing the evidence of her murders. But on March 30th, 1896, near Caversham Lock, a bargeman made a find that would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Reading baby farmer. Floating in the murky waters of the River Thames, a parcel was spotted. It was unusually heavy and wrapped in brown paper, tied with white tape. The bargeman, accustomed to seeing all manner of debris in the river, was nonetheless struck by its suspicious appearance. Upon retrieving it, he found that the parcel contained the tiny body of an infant girl. The child, later identified as Doris Marman, was barely 4 months old. The discovery immediately triggered a police investigation. The local constabulary, led by Superintendent James Anderson of the Reading Borough Police, began a meticulous examination of the parcel and its contents. What they found was crucial. The white tape around the infant's neck, used for strangulation, was distinctive. More importantly, within the wrapping paper, they discovered a small piece of paper, a receipt or a letter fragment, bearing the name Mrs. Thomas and an address in Caversham. This seemingly insignificant scrap of paper was the first tangible link to the perpetrator. Superintendent Anderson, a seasoned officer, understood the gravity of the find. He knew that such a discovery was rarely an isolated incident in the context of baby farming. The police immediately began to trace the address and the name Mrs. Thomas. Their inquiries led them to a house in Caversham, where they found Amelia Dyer, living under the alias of Mrs. Thomas. The initial search of Dyer's premises was discreet but thorough. What the officers uncovered was not a single piece of damning evidence, but a chilling collection of items that painted a horrifying picture. They found numerous baby clothes, some still bearing the names of infants, and more importantly, a large quantity of white tape, identical to that found around Doris Marman's neck. There were also letters from desperate mothers inquiring about their children, and pawn tickets for baby clothes, suggesting that Dyer had sold off the belongings of her victims. The most damning evidence, however, came from Dyer herself. Under questioning, she initially maintained her innocence, but her composure soon began to crack. The weight of the evidence, combined with the relentless questioning, led her to make a partial confession. She admitted to disposing of bodies in the river, though she initially tried to downplay her direct involvement in the deaths, claiming the children had died naturally. The discovery of Doris Marman's body was not just the finding of a single victim, it was the key that unlocked a much larger, more sinister operation. The police, now armed with a suspect and a method, began to drag the River Thames and its tributaries. Over the following days and weeks, more bodies were recovered, each wrapped in a similar fashion, each bearing the grim signature of Amelia Dyer. The sheer number of discoveries sent shockwaves through the community and across the nation. The meticulous police work, from the initial tracing of the paper fragment to the systematic dredging of the river, was a testament to the growing professionalism of Victorian law enforcement. They had finally found the thread that led them directly to the heart of the baby farming horror, and the name Amelia Dyer, or Mrs. Thomas, was now irrevocably linked to a reign of terror that had claimed countless innocent lives. The whispers and suspicions had finally coalesced into undeniable proof, and the net was closing around one of England's most prolific serial killers. Chapter 11: The Net Closes. The discovery of Doris Marman's body and the subsequent police investigation rapidly tightened the net around Amelia Dyer. On April 3, 1896, just days after the initial find, Superintendent Anderson and his officers formally arrested Amelia Dyer at her home in Caversham. The arrest was not a quiet affair. The public, already stirred by the newspaper reports of bodies being pulled from the Thames, watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Upon her arrest, Dyer was taken to the police station for questioning. Initially, she maintained a facade of innocence, attempting to deflect suspicion and feign ignorance. However, the police were well prepared. They presented her with the evidence found in her home, the distinctive white tape, the baby clothes, the letters from desperate mothers, and the pawn tickets. Confronted with these tangible links to her crimes, her composure began to crack. During the interrogation, Dyer made a partial confession, admitting to disposing of bodies in the river. She claimed that the children had died naturally and that she had merely disposed of them to avoid scandal and the expense of a proper burial. This attempt to mitigate her culpability was quickly undermined by the sheer volume of bodies being recovered from the Thames and the consistent method of strangulation. The police were not convinced by her narrative of accidental deaths. The search of her premises continued, yielding further incriminating evidence. Officers meticulously documented every item, building a comprehensive case against her. They found more letters from mothers, some containing money orders, confirming the financial transactions for the care of their children. They also discovered a significant amount of white tape, identical to that used to strangle Doris Marmon and found on other recovered bodies. This physical evidence was crucial, providing a direct link between Dyer and the victims. The most damning evidence, however, came from the river itself. Following the initial discovery, the police launched an extensive search operation, dragging sections of the Thames and its tributaries. The results were horrifying. Over the following weeks, numerous small weighted parcels were recovered from the water. Each contained the body of an infant, and many bore the grim signature of Dyer's method, the distinctive white tape wrapped tightly around their necks. The sheer number of bodies, estimated to be at least 6, directly linked to her during the investigation, and the consistent modus operandi, left no doubt that a serial killer was at work. The public reaction to these revelations was one of profound shock and outrage. Newspapers, which had previously published Dyer's advertisements, now ran sensational headlines detailing the gruesome discoveries. The Reading baby farmer became a figure of national infamy, her name synonymous with unspeakable cruelty. The scale of her crimes, and the cold, calculated manner in which they were committed, horrified a society that prided itself on its moral rectitude. The police investigation was thorough and methodical, piecing together Dyer's movements, her aliases, and the tragic fates of the children entrusted to her. They interviewed mothers who had given their children to Dyer, some of whom had grown suspicious over time. These testimonies, combined with the physical evidence and Dyer's own partial admissions, built an unassailable case. Amelia Dyer was formally charged with murder. The evidence against her was overwhelming, painting a picture of a woman who had systematically exploited the desperation of vulnerable mothers and brutally extinguished the lives of countless innocent infants for financial gain. The net had finally closed, bringing an end to her decades-long reign of terror and preparing the way for her to face justice for her heinous crimes. Chapter 12. The Trial of Amelia Dyer. The trial of Amelia Dyer commenced on May 22, 1896, at the Old Bailey in London. The proceedings captivated the nation, drawing immense public and press attention. The courtroom was packed, eager to witness the fate of the woman dubbed the Ogress of Reading, whose crimes had exposed a dark underbelly of Victorian society. The prosecution, led by the formidable Mr. Charles Matthews, presented a meticulously constructed case, leaving little room for doubt regarding Dyer's guilt. The primary charge against Amelia Dyer was the murder of Doris Marmon, the infant whose body had been discovered in the Thames. However, the prosecution skillfully used the evidence of other recovered bodies and Dyer's systematic modus operandi to paint a broader picture of serial murder. They argued that the death of Doris Marmon was not an isolated incident, but merely one in a long line of similar atrocities. The prosecution's case relied heavily on several key pieces of evidence. Firstly, the discovery of Doris Marmon's body, wrapped in brown paper and weighted with a brick, with a distinctive white tape around her neck. This physical evidence was presented in court, a stark and chilling reminder of the victim's fate. Secondly, the fragment of paper found with Doris's body, bearing the name Mrs. Thomas and an address in Caversham. This crucial clue directly led police to Amelia Dyer. Thirdly, the evidence gathered from Dyer's home following her arrest. Police officers testified to finding large quantities of white tape, identical to that used on Doris Marmon, along with baby clothes, letters from mothers, and pawn tickets for infant garments. These items collectively demonstrated a pattern of receiving infants, disposing of their belongings, and possessing the means to commit the murders. Fourthly, the testimonies of police officers involved in the river search. They recounted the grim task of recovering multiple infant bodies from the Thames, many of which also bore the signature white tape around their necks. While these other deaths were not part of the direct murder charge for Doris Marmon, they served to establish Dyer's consistent method and the scale of her criminal enterprise. Fifthly, the testimonies of mothers who had entrusted their children to Dyer. While many were reluctant to speak due to shame, some bravely came forward, detailing their interactions with Dyer, the fees they paid, and the subsequent disappearance of their children. Their accounts highlighted Dyer's deceptive practices and the vulnerability she exploited. Amelia Dyer's defense was minimal. Her legal team attempted to argue that she was insane, a strategy often employed in cases of such extreme depravity. They pointed to her history of institutionalization for mental health issues, suggesting that she was not of sound mind and therefore not fully responsible for her actions. However, the prosecution countered this by demonstrating that Dyer's crimes were not the result of a disordered mind acting impulsively, but rather a series of calculated systematic acts carried out over many years with clear financial motives. Her ability to plan, deceive, and evade capture for so long undermined the claim of incapacitating insanity. Throughout the trial, Dyer's demeanor was noted by observers. She appeared calm, almost detached, showing little emotion or remorse. This stoicism, while perhaps intended to convey a sense of innocence or mental instability, instead reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a cold, calculating killer. She offered no direct testimony in her own defense, relying solely on her legal counsel. After a trial lasting only 4.5 days, the jury deliberated for a mere 4.5 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. The swiftness of their decision underscored the overwhelming nature of the evidence presented. The judge, Mr. Justice Hawkins, then pronounced the mandatory sentence for murder, death by hanging. The conviction of Amelia Dyer brought a sense of grim satisfaction to a public horrified by her deeds. It was a stark reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of Victorian society, and a testament to the growing resolve of law enforcement to bring such perpetrators to justice. The trial, though focused on a single murder, effectively condemned her for a lifetime of infanticide, marking the end of her reign of terror. Chapter 13: The Hangman's Noose. Following her swift conviction, Amelia Dyer was transferred to Newgate Prison, a notorious institution in London, to await her execution. The period between sentencing and execution was typically a time of intense psychological torment for condemned prisoners, often marked by appeals, confessions, or profound despair. For Dyer, however, her final days were characterized by a remarkable, almost unsettling composure. During her time in Newgate, she was visited by prison chaplains and officials, but she offered no further confessions beyond her initial partial admission of disposing of bodies. She maintained her stoic demeanor, showing little outward sign of remorse or fear. This steadfast composure, consistent with her behaviour throughout the trial, further solidified the public's perception of her as a cold and unfeeling individual, utterly devoid of human empathy. Her silence on the full extent of her crimes meant that the true number of her victims would forever remain an estimate, a chilling testament to her ability to erase lives without a trace. The date for her execution was set for June 10, 1896. Public interest remained exceptionally high. While executions were no longer the public spectacles they once were, having been moved inside prison walls in 1868, the morbid fascination with Dyer's case ensured that the event was widely reported. Crowds still gathered outside Newgate Prison on the morning of an execution, eager for any news, a testament to the profound impact her crimes had on the national psyche. On the morning of June 10, Amelia Dyer was led to the gallows within Newgate Prison. She was 59 years old. Accounts from those present describe her as calm and collected, walking steadily to the scaffold. When asked if she had any last words, she reportedly replied, "I have nothing to say." This final silence was perhaps her ultimate act of defiance, or simply a reflection of her inherent lack of emotional response to the gravity of her situation. The execution was carried out by James Billington, one of the most prominent hangmen of the era. The process was swift and clinical, designed to be as efficient as possible. At 9 a.m., Amelia Dyer was hanged. Her death marked the end of a criminal career that had spanned decades and claimed an untold number of innocent lives. The news of her execution was met with a sense of grim satisfaction across Britain. Newspapers reported her death with headlines that underscored the public's relief that justice had been served. While the act of hanging was a brutal one, there was little sympathy for Dyer. Her crimes, particularly against the most vulnerable members of society, had evoked a deep sense of moral outrage. Her case became a stark warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of society and the need for greater vigilance. Amelia Dyer's execution closed the chapter on her individual reign of terror, but it did not erase the societal conditions that had allowed her to flourish. Her death, however, served as a powerful catalyst for change, forcing a deeper examination of the baby farming industry and the systemic failures that had enabled such widespread infanticide. The hangman's noose brought an end to her life, but it also tightened the resolve of reformers to ensure that such horrors would not be repeated. Chapter 14: A Legacy of Reform. The execution of Amelia Dyer brought a definitive end to her individual reign of terror, but her legacy extended far beyond the gallows. Her case, with its horrifying revelations of widespread infanticide and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable mothers and children, served as a powerful and undeniable catalyst for social reform in Britain. It forced a reluctant society to confront the grim realities of the baby farming industry and the systemic failures that had allowed such atrocities to persist for so long. Prior to Dyer's conviction, legislative efforts to regulate childcare were piecemeal and largely ineffective. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1872, for instance, required individuals who took in more than one infant for payment to register with local authorities. However, this act was poorly enforced, easily circumvented by baby farmers who took in only one child at a time or simply moved frequently, and lacked the necessary powers of inspection. Dyer herself had been briefly imprisoned under this act in 1879, but it had done little to deter her. The sheer scale and brutality of Dyer's crimes, widely publicized in the press, created an unprecedented public outcry. The image of countless infant bodies, weighted and discarded in the Thames, shocked the nation into action. It became impossible for lawmakers and the public to ignore the desperate plight of unmarried mothers and the utter lack of protection for illegitimate children. The case highlighted the urgent need for more robust legislation and stricter enforcement. In response to the public's outrage and the undeniable evidence presented by cases like Dyer's, the British Parliament passed the Infant Life Protection Act of 1897, just a year after her execution. This new act was a significant improvement on its predecessor. It lowered the threshold for registration, requiring anyone who took in even a single infant under the age of 5 for payment to register with the local authority. Crucially, it also granted local authorities greater powers of inspection, allowing them to visit registered homes and ensure the welfare of the children. Penalties for non-compliance were also strengthened. While the 1897 Act was a step forward, it was still not perfect. It primarily focused on regulating register homes and did not fully address the underlying social issues that drove mothers to baby farmers in the first place. However, it laid the groundwork for future reforms. Over the subsequent decades, further legislation, such as the Children Act of 1908, often called the Children's Charter, continued to expand protections for children, regulate adoption, and establish a more comprehensive framework for child welfare. Amelia Dyer's case also contributed to a broader shift in societal attitudes. It brought the issue of child protection to the forefront of public discourse, fostering a greater sense of collective responsibility for the welfare of all children, regardless of their legitimacy. Charitable organizations dedicated to child welfare, such as the NSPCC, gained increased support and influence, advocating for stronger social safety nets and greater support for single mothers. Her story remains a chilling reminder of the consequences when societal judgment, economic hardship, and a lack of regulatory oversight converge to create an environment ripe for exploitation. Amelia Dyer's place in the annals of true crime is secured not only by the horrific nature of her individual acts, but also by the profound impact her exposure had on shaping the legal and social landscape of child protection in Britain. Her crimes, though unspeakable, ultimately forced a nation to look inward and begin the long, arduous process of safeguarding its most vulnerable citizens. Epilogue: Echoes in the Water. The waters of the River Thames continue their ceaseless flow, carrying with them the echoes of a dark chapter in history. The memory of Amelia Dyer, the Reading baby farmer, serves as a stark and enduring testament to the depths of human depravity and the profound vulnerability of the innocent. Her story is a chilling reminder that evil can wear a mask of benevolence, operating in the shadows of societal neglect and exploiting the desperation of those with nowhere else to turn. The tiny, nameless victims, whose lives were brutally extinguished and whose bodies were silently discarded, represent a collective tragedy that transcends the individual horror of their deaths. They are a poignant symbol of the countless children lost to the unregulated baby farming industry, a grim consequence of a society that, for too long, prioritized moralistic judgment over compassion and protection. While the laws and social structures have evolved significantly since the Victorian era, the fundamental lessons from Amelia Dyer's case remain relevant. It underscores the critical importance of vigilance, the need for robust social safety nets, and the continuous effort required to safeguard the most vulnerable among us. The echoes of those silent departures in the water serve as a perpetual warning, urging us never to forget the fragility of life and the enduring responsibility we bear to protect it. Bibliography. Primary sources. Newspaper archives, 1870s to 1890s. The Times, London. The Daily Telegraph. The Reading Mercury, Bristol Mercury, and Daily Post. Lloyd's weekly newspaper, consulted for contemporary reports on baby farming, advertisements placed by Amelia Dyer, coverage of her arrest and trial, and public reaction. Official records. Coroner's inquest records, e.g., for Doris Marmon and other recovered infants. Police investigation files, Reading Borough Police, Metropolitan Police. Court transcripts, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, for the trial of Amelia Dyer. Prison records, Newgate Prison, for Amelia Dyer's incarceration. Birth, marriage, and death certificates, for Amelia Dyer, her family, and identified victims. Workhouse and asylum records, for insights into social welfare and Dyer's institutionalizations. Parliamentary papers, reports related to the Infant Life Protection Acts, 1872, 1897, and discussions on child welfare. Secondary sources. Books, Rose, Lionel. The Massacre of the Innocents, Infanticide in Britain 1800 to 1939. Routledge and Kegan Paul, 1986. A foundational text on infanticide and baby farming in Britain. Jackson, Mark. The Age of Stress, Science and the Search for Stability. Walkowitz, Judith R. City of Dreadful Delight, Narratives of Sexual Danger in Late Victorian London. Robb, George. Female Criminality in Victorian England. Davies, Andrew. The Gangs of London, From the East End to the West End. Virgin Books, 2013.